vibrate. Nope, it wasn't, but now it is. You know, it's kind of funny. Funny, peculiar, funny, odd. However many years ago now, I had the opportunity to have LASIK surgery, and I was pretty blind. I was nearsighted, pretty bad nearsighted, and plastered all over the walls as you walk in to the suite where they were performing the LASIK surgery was this same sign over and over again. No cell phones, no cell phones. If you're expecting an important call, take it outside. Go outside. No cell phones in here. And I guess because of maybe the signal or something would mess up with the laser for the LASIK. I don't really know. And everybody was going through that door right over there. Okay. And I was sitting right here, and there's a lady sitting right about there. Just a kid, you know. And my lovely bride got up, walked over there, and said, "The sign says take it outside," and or something like that. And she took it outside. I don't remember exactly what Cindy said, but she said something to her about that. But you know, isn't it amazing how we just overlook? We see it so often, we don't even read it. We don't even know what it says. So I don't know why that came to mind. No extra charge. Suppose you're on vacation, and suppose it's Sunday, and suppose you're looking for a church to go to, and you find a church, and you go in, and you sit down for worship service, and they don't pray once. What would you think?
They don't pray what?
They do not pray at all, not once.
Church.
You think you might go to another church? What if you're at that church and they're not praying, and not only that, they don't even talk about God? You're not in church, you don't have any business being there.
You better start praying.
You think you better start praying. What good would it be to be in a service that doesn't pray and doesn't talk about God?
You're wasting your time.
It wouldn't do you any good. I wouldn't go back, that's for sure.
I don't even know if I'd stay till the end.
But there's a book in the Bible that doesn't talk about prayer and it doesn't talk about God. Why is it in there?
Because God has a message for us.
But it does. There's no prayer.
There may be a difference in the message for us if we don't understand it.
They're not. No, God's not in it. He's not mentioned once in the entire book.
He don't have to be mentioned for him not to be there. He's there. He's invisible.
Well,
It shows how much God cares for his people, though, by the story itself, and how much they follow God, I guess.
okay.
Of course, those Jews were in Babylonia and they were in a foreign country and they probably didn't mention God because they didn't want to be killed.
Well, it's interesting. This is the last book of history in the Old Testament. Once we get past the book of Esther, everything else falls into one of either poetry or wisdom literature or prophetic literature. There is other historical information in some of the other books, but this is the last book that is specifically a book of history. And the narrative of the Jewish people leading up to the 400 silent years before the time of Christ. And it's all about Esther. Esther fills the same kind of role when it comes to the history of the return that Ruth filled in talking about the time of the judges. It's a little vignette, a little scene of something that happened in the life during that time that doesn't really carry forward necessarily a whole lot the history of the people very much. So as we turn to the book of Esther, hello, you're turned on. Why aren't you working? Well, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. Humor, RR. Historically speaking, as we turn to the book of Esther, I read from chapter 4 just a little bit ago, but if you turn to the book of Esther, it'll tell you in chapter 1, verse 1, that it was the days of Ahasuerus, and the Ahasuerus that it's speaking about, and the Ahasuerus that it's considering is during the around 480 BC, something like that. I gave you a date up there of 483 BC, and the events that are happening there happening in the third year of that. And so by the time that we get to 483 BC, we've already had one group of exiles return from Persia to Jerusalem, Judea. And that was around 538 or so. We had another wave come back around 522 or 520 or so. And so the temple has been built. And the prophets Haggai and Zechariah have done their thing. And so what we have now, people are living in Judah. People are living in Jerusalem. Worship is going on there. But what we see are Jewish people still living in Persia, in the area known as, formerly known as Babylon, that have not chosen to go back to Judah. And in one sense, Esther was born there. This is all she's ever known. Probably Mordecai, her uncle, has been born there as well, and this is all that he has ever known. And so at this point in time, when we get here, they are in the city of Susa, also known as Elam, which is in southwest Iran today. And I could tell you it's tied to both Iranian plateau and Mesopotamia. There's basically two capital cities for Persia, a southern capital city and a northern capital city. The southern capital city was Susa. The northern capital city was the city of Babylon. More happened here because this was closer to where Cyrus and the Persians originally came from in the Iranian plateau rather than in Mesopotamia. You're still not going to work. Cotton picking. So historically, that's what's going on. Oh, I know why it's not working. Hello. You have to be smarter than the technology to get the technology to work. Ha! Canonical, meaning its placement in the Bible, it's part of God's holy word, is what canonical is all about. It's kind of hotly debated. Why is this book in here? Because as you see, it's the only Old Testament book that does not mention Yahweh or Elohim or prayer, although it does speak about fasting. And in a book that tells us about God, you would think that it would need to mention God. In a book that wants us to drive us closer to God so that we will spend time in praying to God, you would think it would spend a little bit of time talking about prayer and having at least an example of prayer, but there's none of that. However, having said that, out of all 66 Old Testament books, and out of all the available manuscripts that we have, Esther appears more often than any other book. You know, there may be a couple of thousand copies of Genesis and 1,800 copies of Exodus or something like that, and then there's 4,000 copies of Esther, which is really kind of strange, kind of crazy whenever you stop and you think about it. How do Christians normally handle the book of Esther? How many of you have ever heard somebody preach through the book of Esther in a sermon series? There are not a whole lot of hands up. for that matter, there's not any hands up. How many of you have heard a pastor go through Esther on a Wednesday evening in Bible study? What's the closest thing to us studying Esther?
Such a time as this, I've heard sermons on that.
Okay, for such a time as this passage that I read. About the closest we get to actually studying it is probably in the Sunday school literature that we use. Some point in time during the 8-year cycle to study all 66 books in 8 years, it probably gives a Sunday or two to Esther. Some Christians say it's history, and that's all, and so we better understand what was going on with the Israelite people, and that makes a certain amount of sense. Others will say it's prophetic allegory, not any historical element tied to it at all, and it's there because it's this elaborate parable that has been crafted and written and everything else. And but usually it's historical, and it's usually ignored because there's not any kind of blatant moral benefit out of it. There's not any kind of blatant doctrinal benefit out of it. So here's the structure. Whenever we get started, King Ahasuerus is married to a woman by the name of Vashti. Believe it or not, I knew a woman named Vashti. She was the daughter of a couple of missionaries, and she was born in a South American country, and she was in one of the classes I had at, I think she was in the Old Testament for that matter, class that I had when I taught at DBU. And her name was Vashti, which rather odd. It's not a common name. That's chapter 1. We see Queen Vashti and Ahasuerus, and they're married, and then they get divorced. And then he gets remarried in chapter 2, and he marries Esther. At that point, we think, well, so much, but you may have been in this position, being in the right place at the right time, and the whole need for being in the right place at the right time is because of this fellow named Haman. And Haman, the idea that he was a big wig and he was honored by everybody is pretty much most of chapter 3. And then he comes up with this plot that he's going to destroy the Jews. Esther is a Jew. He's going to destroy all Jews. And so Esther has a dilemma in chapters 4 and the first part of chapter 5. And it gets worse. Haman now begins to plot Mordecai's death. And the only way Mordecai can be saved and the only way the Jewish people can be saved is if Esther steps up. And she does step up. And so salvation for all Jews. And then they celebrate this new holiday right here, Purim. And that's all about chapters 9, and chapter 10 is a pretty short chapter. So Queen Vashti gets divorced. What kind of rights did a queen have in a largely patriarchal society?
I think it looks like she didn't still have too much of rights. She still would have to go to like the king mostly called they didn't mostly go in before the king, I think, on their own.
Right, if she went into the king on her own, it could mean the death penalty. Yeah. So, well, do men do stupid things sometimes?
Not me.
This is a question. This isn't a cause for laughter. Sometimes.
We are told that we do that by our wives. That's the only reason they're done. I mean, it's said that it's done that way.
What happens when a bunch of men get together and they get drunk?
They get more stupid.
They get more stupid. Well, Esther chapter 1 opens up with this party. King Ahasuerus decides to have this 180-day, that's 6-month long celebration, and he's bringing everybody into his capital city, and he's showing everything off, and it's like a huge welcome party, or open house or something for him. And in the last 7 days, it is nonstop drunk. And in the midst of nonstop drunk, at the height of all of this, what did the king ask of Vashti?
He wanted to show her off, I think. He showed him everything else, so he said, now look what I got, my beautiful queen.
Well, look at chapter 1, verse 8. Drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. In other words, you don't have to drink if you don't want to. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Now, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he was rip-roaring drunk, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbana, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the queen with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. So what is King Ahasuerus doing at the height of his drunk?
Was the queen doing something? She said no.
He wants to show off Vashti to everybody else. I have married this babe. You need to see her. Now, I'll go ahead and take it a step further. The way it's worded in the Hebrew text and the choice of the Hebrew words that are used, when it says that he was to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, that was the only thing she was to be wearing. Just her royal crown. And so how did Vashti respond?
I don't think so, I ain't going.
Something along the lines, I'm sorry?
She rebelled.
She rebelled. She said no. And so as a result of all that, verse 16, Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong by refusing to come thus attired, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. They will say, well, Ahasuerus commanded Vashti to be brought before him. She didn't come, so why do I have to come? This very day, the noble women of Persian Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. What is Memucan afraid of? Well, all women will rebel against their husbands, is what he's afraid of. So let the king, if it pleases the king, verse 19, let a royal order go out from him. Let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come for King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than he. And the advice pleased the king and the princes, and so they made it so. So he let Queen Vashti go. He basically divorced her when they said, let someone else take her place.
So it was like #MeToo.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Do men do stupid things sometimes? What? He did. Well, Esther is made queen then in chapter 2. The whole idea is that now that Vashti is gone, the king is queenless, and so they need to do something about all of this. And so there was an opening if you will, for queen. And so Esther was living with Mordecai, who is her cousin, who had adopted her, and she was taken to be part of the Bachelor Susa edition. And so it was all going to be this one eligible bachelor with all these women all around him. They were looking for the brightest, the sharpest, the most beautiful in all the kingdom. And there's quite a bit of competition here. And despite all of this competition, Esther actually becomes queen. Now it's interesting, as we look back through extra biblical literature and we look at what was going on, and we understand the time frame for chapter 1 and the time frame for chapter 2. Chapter 2 starts with this. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what he had done, what had been decreed against her. And that's when the king's young men said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king. And that's how Esther got taken, and that's how she became the next queen. Based on the best information that we have, there's a 4-year gap between chapter 1 and chapter 2. But Ahasuerus was busy during that 2 years because he went off and attacked Greece, and then he came back. And then he gets to feeling lonely. And he remembers all that's going on. And there's a movie that is made out of all of this called One Night with the King. And basically they got all the women, and they said, surely one of these women, one of these lovely young virgins will be the next queen. And each one of them spent a night with the king. And after everything was said and done, if he was happy, or the one he was happiest with, she would become the next queen. And Esther was the one that he was happiest with, and so she became queen. Well, Haman was a prince, and he was very pleased with himself, and he desired a place of prominence in the kingdom. And pleased with his new position, Haman decided that everybody should bow down to him. Chapter 3, verse 1, Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants, verse 2, who were at the king's gate, bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had commanded concerning him. He's in a good position. He is second in command of the entire nation. However, there's one person who did not bow down and pay him homage. And that one person's name is Mordecai. Haman gets furious. It says, verse 4, they spoke to him, Mordecai, day after day, and he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. He had said he was a Jew. Haman saw Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him. Haman was filled with fury. Do men do stupid things sometimes? This was his idea. Haman was an Agagite, King Agag. Remember Samuel? The Amalekites were to be put to the sword, Haram, total destruction, completely wiping out, and they came back with critters and King Agag. Tradition tells us that King Agag had a pregnant wife, and she lived. And from her son, all the way down, comes to Haman. Mordecai was a Jew, if tradition is correct. Mordecai was a Jew. And so what Haman decides is to get rid of all Jews everywhere. He is mad at Mordecai. He's found out that Mordecai is a Jew. He won't, he just, he can't hardly stand it. So chapter 3, verse 12, the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps, to the governors over all the provinces, to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of Ahasuerus. It was sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instructions to do what? Isn't that a little overkill? Destroy, kill, and annihilate? to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. He's going to get his revenge. So this is going to get back at Mordecai, because Mordecai is a Jew. There's another problem, isn't there? Who is Mordecai's cousin that he adopted? Queen Esther. So, Mordecai encouraged Esther to intervene on the Jews' behalf. And in chapter 4, Esther agrees to help the Jews, but first she said no. And here's what happened. In chapter 4, verse 9, Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said, and Esther spoke to Hathach, commanded him to go to Mordecai and say this: all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death, unless the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. They told Mordecai what Esther said, and Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. It is written, Jews will be destroyed, Jews will be killed. If you keep silent to this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. You and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So Esther said to Mordecai, gather all the Jews, hold a fast, do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will fast, and then I will go to the king. And if I perish, I perish. After much deliberation, after much fasting, she agreed to do it. What did this mean for Esther? So she is taking her life in her own hands. However, the laws of the Persians and the Medes can't be repealed, so what good would it do? What risk was Esther taking? Her life. Her life in order to save the lives of the Jews. Do we face anything anywhere near this severe?
The Jews did during World War II.
How about Christians in 2000 and whatever year this is, 19? We don't face anything this severe, but are we scared of anything?
Look at all the churches that have had people go in and kill people in the church for no reason, just because they're there.
Well, I'm wondering if we're scared of something a lot less. We're scared about what people will think. I mean, yeah, there's cases of gunmen having gone into churches and having killed people, but are Christians afraid of what people will think in 2019?
I don't think you can be if you're on the side of the Lord. No, I don't care what people think.
I think some Christians do.
Maybe it's like somebody in your family had done something really terrible, and they would feel a little embarrassed if their Christian brothers and sisters heard that happened in their family or something. It might make you a little bit, say, no, I don't want anybody to know that's happening in my family.
I think a lot of people would share the gospel, except they're afraid of what somebody will say.
Oh yeah, we should have thought of that first.
So she's taking her life in her own hands. She goes in, and what happened? He held out the golden scepter, asked, what do you want? So, first stage of this is taken care of and is passed. So now, Haman chose the date that they were going to be killed, and if you recall exactly how it was worded, it was, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. December 13th, for lack of a better way of putting it. Chose that day by lot. Meaning he put like he wrote the different days, the different months on 12 different stones or 13 different stones, put them in there, pulled out Adar out of a bag, and then put numbers 1 through 28 and reached in there and pulled out 13. So he says Adar the 13th. That's what it means by lot. And the word for that is pure, P-U-R, pur. And so the word, the plural word, the plural version of pur is purim or Purim. And so Haman chose that date for the destruction of the Jews by casting lots. As it turned out, that day was the most propitious for his own destruction. Haman was so mad that he built a gallows in his front yard to hang somebody on. How tall was that gallows? 75 feet tall. Why do you need a gallows that tall to hang one person?
I guess so everybody can see him.
So everybody can see him. Now, what happened was Esther invited Haman and the king to a feast. And after that feast, she says, come to another feast tomorrow and I'll tell you what I want. And now Haman, he's second in command. Everybody's bowing down to him. He has no idea that she's a Jew, but he's so excited about coming back the next night. They had just built this gallows to hang Mordecai. And she says, well, something has happened. Said, somebody hates me and hates my people. And the king says, what are you talking about? And she says, well, it's that filthy man Haman who decreed that all Jews must die because I am a Jew. And Haman's... So he made a 75-foot tall gallows to hang somebody to be a public display. He gets hung on his own gallows. Haman is out of the way, but what problem still exists? The decree is still in place. And the laws of the Persians and the Medes cannot be repealed. So that's what they did. They wrote another law. And the law that they wrote was if anybody tries to attack you and you're a Jew on this day, you have the right to defend yourself in turn. And if you kill them, you get to take their property. In short order. In chapter 8, verse 13. Chapter 8. Let's back up to the middle part of verse 10. He wrote in the name of Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring. He sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from royal stud, saying the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives and to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods on one day throughout all the provinces, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. A copy was written, couriers mounted on swift horses rode out hurriedly, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. They can kill the Jews on the 13th of Adar. The Jews can gather together and defend themselves on the 13th of Adar. What happened? In the 12th month, chapter 9, verse 1, the month of Adar, the 13th day, the king's command and edict were about to be carried out. The very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. They gathered in cities throughout all the provinces. No one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all people. All the officials of the provinces and satraps and governors and royal agents helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. Verse 11, that very day the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? What is your wish? It shall be granted you. What further is your request? It'll be fulfilled. And Esther said, well, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to today's edict. And let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. And so they had another day in the citadel of Susa. Big picture, verse 16. The Jews who were in the king's provinces gathered to defend their lives, and they got relief, and they killed how many?
5,000.
Of those who hated them, and they laid no hands on their plunder. The date was chosen by lot. They were delivered on the date that was chosen by lot. And to celebrate their deliverance, the Jews celebrate the festival of Purim to this very day. There are 2 holy days, 2 festival occasions Jewish people observe that are not prescribed in the Levitical law. One of these is Purim, the other is Hanukkah. And they still celebrate it to this very day. Esther recounts for us a tale of what life was like during the exile. It wasn't that hard. She became queen, for crying out loud. It shows that those who did not return to Jerusalem had good lives, although they were hated by Haman. Also gives us the origin of the Jewish Feast of Purim. The providence of God. God's not mentioned. Prayer is not mentioned. Nobody goes to church in this book. Yet you can't read this book and see the events that happen without seeing the providence of God underlying everything that's in there. It maintains and cares for both the community and the individual. God is not mentioned. Providence of God is taken for granted. He's at work protecting his own. He placed Mordecai in a position so that he knew what was going on. He placed Esther in a position. Perhaps she was in the right place at the right time. Reliance on any kind of supernatural power other than Yahweh or God Almighty is foolish. Haman believed in fate and his own self-direction. He just went with lots to choose a date. His gods were above space and time as we recognize it. Yahweh was involved in the lives of the people, acting on their behalf. Obedience to God. Maybe it includes doing the thing we don't want to do. Being strong, being sure, interceding, placing our life on the line. People don't want to hear the good news. Let them know anyway. That's Esther. Questions, comments, thoughts?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When we started, we were talking about King Esarhaddon.
Mm-hmm.
Where does Xerxes come in?
It's 2 different names for the same person.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
I'm Pastor Payne, but I'm also Brother Andrew.
So they were one and the same.
Yes. I'm sorry? It uses Xerxes a couple of times. Most of the time it's Ahasuerus.
I think it was a really good story. I really liked it.
Well, Hollywood took a lot of liberties whenever they made the movie One Night with the King. And they didn't really... They took some liberties, but they also cleaned it up a bit. Made it to make it PG rated instead of R rated, if you will. It's actually a pretty good movie. I enjoyed it. So yeah, and if he is compiling a harem and the one who's going to please him the most, you pretty much know what they're doing. The one night she's with the king. In the movie, he's reading and she's talking to him about what he's read. Yeah. So, and he seems to be a pretty something of a simpleton. He shouldn't have been king in the first place in the movie. So, other questions, comments, thoughts?
How do you pronounce Xerxes?
Xerxes?
Jersey?
Yeah, like a ZH. Xerxes.
I thought you were talking about another person. I go, who's he talking about? Did you pronounce Ahab? When I say Ahab, you pronounce
Ahab and Baal instead of Baal.
That was Esther's husband.
See, Ahab was an Arab. He was Sheik of the Burning Sands. But King Ahab was somebody different. Other comments, questions, concerns? So if the next time we get together, if we have jeopardy about all the history, you'll nail this, right? It's not a test, it's a game.